Okay. So my name is Steve Geiger. I'm a tree steward from Arlington, Virginia. And tonight we're pleased to have Melissa Gildea, who's an urban forester with the Department of Parks and Recreation in Arlington. She's been an urban forester in that position for about 5 years, but she's got a pretty interesting background. She's been a landscape architect, a horticulturalist with a lot of nursery management, garden management, and landscape construction experience. She happens to be an exhibit artist and has a lot of experience in landscape architecture, stormwater management, working with plants and soils, ecological and hydrological systems, and horticultural consulting. What we would like to do before we start, Melissa, is have everybody kind of hold your questions, and if you could put them in the chat box, that would be great. And then Melissa, whenever you want to take a break, or if you'd like to wait till the end to answer questions, just let us know and we can read them out to you or open up the floor. Do it. So today's webinar is called Exploring Assumptions About Roots and How That Can Help Us Understand Them in Urban Environments. And with that, Melissa, I'll let you go. If everybody else could just turn off your audio so we don't interrupt it, would be great.
So you can see my screen, or let's see.
Yeah, we're all set.
Okay. So I'm sharing. Can you already see the exploring?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it's there, Melissa.
Okay, great. So I wanted to talk about this today just because I had been traveling around looking at trees in different environments, and it's really exciting to see trees doing all kinds of things you didn't think they were supposed to be doing. So I took a bunch of photos. So this presentation is going to be a little bit in two parts, sort of kind of refresher of things you already know about roots, but just refreshing in the way that, oh, let's remind ourselves so that we can look at these crazy photographs, and then a few urban pictures squeezed in so we can kind of talk about the unusual environments and then how that applies to an urban environment. And then the last part, we're going to talk very specifically about tree preservation in kind of urban residential sites and the complications that affords, and how we're going at it, and some tools. And some tools I don't actually have photographs about, to represent it, but we can go through that in the discussion. So we can have right in the middle, we can have a few questions, and the majority of the questions at the end for discussion. So in the middle, maybe some brief questions. I want to thank Nora for taking a bunch of photographs. So right now, this is there. Okay, so just a reminder here that a root system of a tree is a wine glass on a plate. While roots can go all kinds of depths, it's very uncommon, and especially here in the Mid-Atlantic, for them to be deep, and we all know that. But it's really good to remind ourselves. And we keep saying, under the canopy, that's where the roots are, but really a lot of research shows that different species are very different. And I just learned that Magnolia grandiflora and Magnoliaceae, so that includes tulip poplars, have greater extents than other trees. So understanding the species profile of a root system architecture is helpful in tree preservation. And that roots typically extend beyond the canopy, up to 80% beyond, sometimes even more than that, more than double. And I'm not really going over all of these major components, but just reminding about the structural roots. So the basal roots, the roots right under maybe an oak tree starts as a tap root, and then it stops, you know, and really most of the roots go to lateral structural root production, lateral and structural root production, and then the fine roots form with all the root hairs. And so there's really only two major types of roots, right? So woody and non-woody. So the woody roots are the large lateral roots, and they provide support, like they provide support and compression. So if I'm going to build like a big stone pier, then that's going to push down on the soil, or you put in a light pole, or any kind of structure that you build, you know, you need support of the thing and compression. And that's why you have a footing, right? But so the large lateral roots provide right at the base, right at the trunk flare, that support for the wood and compression. And then they provide anchorage, which is like the wires on the foam pole. And so, and the small lateral roots do the majority of the tension work, the holding the tree up when it's blowing around. And then, you know, everything does the carbohydrate storage, organic compound transport, and then the taproots and sinkers and strikers, which are not in every species, actually store water as well. And so the small roots, which we always forget about, like we talk about roots, and I notice this a lot, is they talk about roots and we say, oh, I didn't run into any roots. And I'm looking at a photograph that somebody just said, oh, there were no roots. And there are all these little roots, these little non-woody roots sticking out of the soil. You can see them everywhere. And they're like, oh, no roots. Those are really important roots. And depending on the weather, they can have more importance. So like, if you didn't hit a single root, but you dug through the soil and you saw all these little hair roots everywhere, and you dug right through them during a drought, then then all that carbohydrate storage plus that all that access to all of the water in the soil, it's gone. It's gone. So so you can really significantly injure a tree by cutting all the little tiny roots off to a large volume of them. And I've seen a tree die of that in the county with no major roots cut. And so all of these roots are important, not just the major woody roots. And so those little ones, they just suck up all the water basically through osmosis. And then we have the adventitious roots. And the adventitious roots, if you cut a root, if you cut a 1-inch root, if you cut a 2-inch root, and that meristem that's there, right? Because the middle is the dead cells, and only the living wood on the outside can form a new root. If you cut it off, you chop it off for construction or whatever. And that new root that comes out the end is considered an adventitious root. And so the adventitious root comes from wounding. It also can come from flooding, right? Like a lot of species like willow and maple, or most of the wetland species, if you push soil up against them, so they're adapted to make new roots from their stem tissue, and then the roots below die off. I've seen trees make adventitious roots when they are blowing around too much as an anchor. We don't really know a lot about what causes a tree to form an adventitious root, and some of them don't form adventitious roots, but you know, that's kind of really interesting, is this totipotency that trees have the ability to transform their cells into different forms. And so they can take a stem cell and make a root out of it. And they can make a branch out of their trunk. And so that they're able to modify their cellular composition in order to fulfill a need. And so if we look at, I'm sorry, this is a little fuzzy, but I just love this photograph because you can see that the trees are wrapping around this rock. And what happened is, you know, that the seed germinated in the leaf litter, and then it sent down a radical, right? Because in the order of operations, as we call it in construction, but it's the order of growth. It's, you know, root growth, shoot growth, leaf growth. Oh, you're not seeing the photo. Is anyone else missing it?
No, it's there.
We can see
Oh,
it,
okay.
yeah.
Okay. It's a little fuzzy. Anyhow, so the root starts extending down, and it just finds a place where it feels like it can anchor. And as it grows and extends, it just through the leaf matter, right? Because the radical's just a little tiny thing. And then as it grows and it extends, it continues to find anchorage. And so as the tree gets bigger and bigger and bigger, it could have stilt roots like this tree. And I've seen this happen on a mound of soil, and then the soil washes away and the tree stays there. And so, you know, the trunk doesn't always come in contact with the soil. Really interesting architecture. And then this is also Nora's picture of a tree which sent out a lot of tissue, probably from the trunk after it grew, just for stability. So it's growing over itself as the soil washes away. I've seen tulip trees, which are often hollow because they don't compartmentalize decay very well, like the Codet model that you learned in your training. They'll be hollow in the interior, and one had not only a hollow but a hollow base. And the interior of the tree, that, you know, it's still a meristem, made a root, and it went straight down in the middle of the tree and anchored it. So it made a little sinker root right in the middle of the trunk. And that tree is still standing. So so trees will move resources around, and depending, you know, it's hard if they have an insect attack and herbivory, like animals eating all the leaves, and then they also have a difficult or stressful environment, you can lose a tree pretty fast. But if there's just one thing to deal with, then the tree can deal with it more easily if they have the food resources, the stored carbohydrates to deal with it. Another rock, again, you know, there probably was a little pocket of debris, and as that tree grew, it just extended the radical, and then it became woody, and continued. And so it had enough to allow it to grow until it got down to the soil. And here, this is a picture I took in Bryce Canyon. You can see the tree way up at the top and the root from that tree all the way down here. And this actually, if you were to look closely, like I stood there and touched all of these roots, this entire slope is full of roots. So that tree's getting water from the snow melt and the runoff when it can. And then when it can't, it's probably got a second set of roots that's up there just with stored sugars. Trees don't always go where we think they're going to, roots don't go where we think they're going to go. The CRZ is not where we think it is, so we'll talk about CRZ in a minute, and it's a tool urban foresters use because we have to conserve trees by looking at plans. And we can't just go out and find all the roots and then tell somebody where to build their building. We have to use some rules of thumb, and the trees are not literate, and they don't they don't know any of our rules. And this is very common where we have a linear root system, and in this case, it's linear in only one direction. And so that tree could uproot if it was pushed from the wrong direction, like from the sidewalk towards the roadway, or it, the opposite towards its own roots. The trees are the weakest in the hinge side. So there's, like if you cut the roots off right at the trunk of a tree, then that would, the opposite of that would be considered the hinge side, right? That's the side that's attached. So it can blow over towards the strong roots. So one of the assumptions is that tree roots are in the CRZs, and they're not. They are where the tree needs them to be.
Melissa, would you just, the critical root zone is what the word is for CRZ, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, just
Yes,
make sure that
yeah.
master naturalists may not be as aware.
Oh, thank you. Yes, so a critical root zone, especially, for those of us that deal with trees and construction, which is a large part of urban forestry. A critical root zone is the area of soil around a tree where the minimum amount of roots considered essential for tree health are located. It's generally in Arlington, we use 1 foot radius per inch DVH. Other areas use 1.5. This is current. We're working on some possible modifications to this based on tree size. So to be clear, it's the minimum amount of roots for tree health. It's not where the roots are. There's this assumption by people who don't understand trees that that's where the roots are, and that's why we explained before that tree roots are way beyond the canopy of a tree. This is generally does coincide with the canopy, depending on the tree and the tree health and the species, but that's the minimum. And in urban forestry, we use this CRZ as a single rule for every kind of tree. I'm sorry, they're cleaning behind me. And that's not really how every different species has a different root architecture. We also, the way we get a CRZ is by measuring diameter breast height, just to give those of you and master naturalists some terms. Diameter breast height was originally a measurement that was invented by foresters because they didn't want to bend down. That's the joke, but it's not really a joke, it's true. It's codified internationally as 4.5 feet from the ground on the high side or the mid, depending on which standard you use. The Forester standard is the high side for measuring a champion tree. It's in the middle, and that diameter is 3 meters in countries that use metric. And then the last of those 3 terms is called the structural root zone, and that's the area essential for tree stability. It does vary species by species, but we have kind of a generous formula, which is pretty good for older trees and may not actually cover enough for younger trees, which actually have bigger structural root zones. So anyhow, tree roots are in the CRZs. And then we see that if I drew CRZs for this picture, that's not where the tree roots would be. I imagine that these trees are very, very old and nutrient poor soil, and they're shallow because of probably 2 things: wind and water erosion. And then on top of it, the soil is not really soil, it's nearly rock or rock. And so they're just getting organic matter from the surface. And this channel eroded and those roots were already there. So pretty crazy. This is from Vincent, my supervisor, Vincent Fairway. So another assumption, tree roots are strong and break up things. So what we were talking about before, oops, I didn't, I don't have the right slide right after this, but I'll show it to you in a minute. But we can go back and look at this sidewalk. So apparently this tree wasn't particularly strong because it wasn't able to go under the sidewalk into the other utility strip. This is a double utility strip. And why is that? It's because all those fine roots, that's those root tips called the radicals. They're very, very small, and they will go, you'll see root aggregation right under pavement sometimes if there's any airspace in the base layer of the sidewalk. They're small enough to fit into some open spaces and get water that's evaporating from the soil underneath the sidewalk. They're small enough to go into void spaces if there are any poorly built bases on the building, or a pipe isn't sealed. Tiny, tiny roots. But they'll go against a curb and turn right or left. They won't be able, they don't have any force. They're just extending and taking advantage of whatever water that they find, good environment. And so if they're going down and there's this limited oxygen, if there's a change in soil texture because somebody compacted all the soil during construction with machines and put topsoil on top, they might not go down very far at all, just to that constrained soil layer. And that's what happened here, that there's all of these surface roots are here. So roots, the way that roots break things is they go in when they're little, and then they become woody, And when they become woody, when they put on their layer of wood, they lift. So they don't have any force on their own when they're extending. It's the lifting all comes from adding wood. So we went through here. However, some trees, this is a pond cypress. I took this down in the Great Dismal Swamp, have adapted. So, many trees can't grow in that hypoxic soil without oxygen, and then some can. So every time there's just no hard and fast rules, that all the rules are flexible. Um, Bald cypress, Taxodium distichum, and a lot of people call pond cypress a subspecies of that. They have knees, and they can live in a hypoxic environment, and their knees breathe. And they're the only tree in Virginia that's an obligate wetland species, meaning always found in a wetland. So primary root functions. So I always remind myself of this, and I don't know why it's such a revelation to me every time, but water, water is like, water's the key. Summer digging of trees. If you want to buy a tree in summer and it's in the nursery, it has this process where you dig a big ditch around it, bigger than the ball. Then or it's about as big as the ball, the inside of it. Then it's watered for a week, because you need the water column to be completely full. You need the tree to be turgid. So it's that water column is so important for trees. And if you don't do that, trees can go into permanent wilt. They can actually die from that because they can't, make carbohydrates and everything. Soil volume requirements. We in Arlington, for all of the trees and developments and public spaces, we have soil volume requirements. The primary driver behind that is water resources. All of the research shows that water resources are limited when you have limited soil volume. And the more a tree can extend its roots, the more water availability it has, and other nutrients, but primarily water. And so it's just, to me, like always a revelation. And then you see the largest trees and where they are, they have abundance of resources, limited stress. So, I was in a hollow looking at a champion tree and way out in the Appalachia, and it was in a low spot, so it wasn't going to get blown over. And then it had tons of water resources because it was near a stream. So, if you look at that and you think about, this is just, it's really kind of a simple equation. There's the ability to elongate. The tree needs a certain amount of, every time it puts on more wood, it needs more resources. So it has to continue to extend its roots to support its volume of wood. And really what that is the exterior volume, right? And so here we have a stormwater facility and a maple. I think this is a maple, looks like, from the bark and the roots. And first of all, it has a limited soil volume, and maples tend to have shallow roots. However, what do you see here? You see a lot of sediment, right? And the sediment, soil generally has, a good quality soil has 50% air in it. And that's helps when it rains. It processes, it has an infiltration rate. And Steve can correct me if I'm wrong about that, because I am not a scientist, I'm a practitioner. But really good soil, old soil that has a structure and a horizon, which we have none of in Arlington, has almost none. We have a couple areas in our Glen that have undisturbed soil in our parks, but it will process water, and the water won't fill up the pore space, so the tree still has air to have functional processes, because the air in the soil is required mostly, right? We just saw the taxodium. And then there's species like maples, which are adapted to live in low oxygen environments. But this is how they adapt, by really shallow root systems. And it's more shallow than it would be otherwise, because the open pore spaces get clogged up by the fine particles in the sediment. And I love my fancy lettering where I cut off the root architecture here. But also, one of the other things that we always think is that roots always hold up trees. And so if we go back here, this is in a stormwater pond. This looks like an old stormwater pond to me. And this looks like this stormwater area that the soil has developed enough clogging, enough structure. That's not really what structure is, but it's old enough that this tree hasn't fallen over. But in our new systems, which are 80% sand, you see the same thing that you see in an area that floods, which is soil failure. So the roots have to be able to hold on to something in a very wet environment. When we have high winds, sometimes the trees don't have enough to hold on to and the soil gives out. And so in this case, it wasn't that the roots gave out, it was that the soil gave out. And then we call that soil failure. So roots don't always hold trees up, and they're not always the cause of the failure. I just took a few pictures to show you, like, first of all, this tree has been buried, so it's going in like a telephone pole into the ground. And then somebody moved the sidewalk out of the way, and that's probably when it got buried. But then it continues to push the sidewalk up, so you can see it raised up the sidewalk 4 inches, and I'm sure the crack in the driveway is from roots under there. And that's a really low oxygen environment, so it can be as low as 10% or 7% under there. But there's water. So this tree's gone under the sidewalk, probably accessed the soil where these shrubbery are growing. It's probably all the way down the street, and it's under this driveway. So, that's an opportunistic, the tree's looking how am I going to hold myself up? Where am I going to store all my food? Where can I extend? Where can I get resources? And I don't mean to humanize a tree, but there's, as the radical extends, it's looking for those opportunities. And then here again in Bryce Canyon, this tree for some reason is still standing. But trees are stronger in tension than compression. So all those uphill roots are probably doing 2/3, maybe up to 80% of the work of holding that tree up, even though they seem to be just sitting on top of the ground. So all the research says that the smaller the root, the more tension work it's doing. So I'd imagine, but I didn't go up and like crawl under this tree and pull on the roots and try to figure out if there are a bunch of buried tension roots, but I imagine that there are. And so another thing I wanted to talk about is that trees are big and can withstand a lot. So I've been doing this little thought experiment lately because I can't get people to understand when they're digging around trees that the only living part of a root is the little, outer layer, the meristem and the bark, and the meristem under the bark, and that the tree has to replace that every year. And so I've been trying to think of how I can explain a tree in engineering terms. And so I came up with a tree is an infrastructure, a tower, okay, that expands every year, and it has a living skin stretched over it with living flags attached, wind sails. And they're little factories. So every year, the tree's got all these cells and they build a new layer. So the tree's actively, continuously building itself. And so, bumping a tree with a big piece of equipment can be a reason that it has to come down. If it's more than a certain percentage of the cylinder, it's not going to be structurally stable anymore after it starts to decay. And so, trees do grow. There's this thing about the resiliency of life. It's just so resilient, it's totipotent. We injure it, it tries to seal the wound. You can cut a tree down sometimes, and the biggest tree that in Washington, D.C. was cut down during the Civil War. It's a chestnut oak. It has 4 or 5 trunks. So those are resprouts. So it was decent size, but maybe not that old. And now it is so massive that I went with a group of 7 people to see it, and we all stood in front of it together. And you could still see the tree beyond on both sides. So I guess we didn't stand in a line, but it's a very big tree. And so you think of the energy that tree had stored in its roots, that it could come up, and it's still alive today with a much older root system. And this again, maple, which took advantage of the root space under the sidewalk and is now tipping it over. But not really that strong and not really that old, and it's not going to last that much longer. So I don't know why the words are not coming up. Oh, here they are. So just kind of thinking about the radical, the original root that comes out of the seed and in nature, and how that expands, and all of those roots expanding, and the adventitious roots from the transplanted tree. And they're just looking for resources, and they can bind up so they can start encircling every time they encounter something. Too much mulch. I was doing an inventory, and somebody had put bricks around the tree, and the radicals kept hitting it and encircling the tree. So the tree was getting girdled by young by new roots, it wasn't like that from the nursery, but the bricks just sitting on top of the soil were causing, because it was a maple, had surface roots, were causing girdling roots. And we have a requirement that mulch needs to be away from the trunk because too much mulch can cause that. So trees are just not as, they're very resilient because the resiliency of life, but they are not, we can affect them and create defects very easily. Again, I told you at a curb, very often when we pull a curb off, you'll see a stacked root system just heading down the street because the radical hit the curb, or the adventitious root as it extended hit the curb when it was small, and then just turned and ran down. And I know of an instance of tree preservation where there was a tree against a house, they demolished the house, and the tree just had linear roots along the house. So people get really worried about their foundations, and it's really satisfying to read things from Royal Horticulture Society because, you know, in England they live in much older buildings, and they're like, yeah, we don't really worry about trees unless the foundation is not stable. And so it's a case by case basis, but it's not like the trees are not going to destroy your foundation just because they're there. And by the way, I have a 40-inch maple 10 feet from my house. Wood expansion. So again, the wood expansion is what happens with trees and infrastructure, and also the way it's built. So there's lots of research about sidewalks and pathways. And if you have a free-flowing layer, like an open gravel, where it has air and water can pass through, then the trees will not send up roots. Another strategy is adequate soil volume. And so in urban areas, most of the site plans are now using different expanded soil volume strategies. So we've had people put Jersey barriers underneath the sidewalk, buried to hold up the sidewalks, and then have uncompacted soil under there. We've had people putting different kind of concrete or plastic crates underneath. And so all of those products keep the infrastructure from having so much conflict with the tree. Because the tree needs a lot more space to stand up than a light pole might. And so I just wanted to explain again that the living skin that's constantly moved out, and what cool model that is for life. And so this engineer, Anna Sandak's trying to develop infrastructure that has a living skin that is self-repairing. And so just to go through, just to remind you about tree biology, it's just the tree's got to grow, right? It's got to constantly expand, and the only living part of the tree, it's not the only functional part of the tree, right? There's some transportation happening in the dead wood, but the only living part is that layer, that active growth layer each year. And so the branches have to extend, the roots have to extend, the leaves have to increase. You have to have more carbohydrates because you've got a bigger skin every year. And it's not like a scientific explanation, but just a thought experiment. And so if a tree's not growing, it's dying. If it can't if it doesn't have enough to put on its growth rings, then it can't make it anymore. And the tree health and structural stability, right, is directly related to the amount of leaves it puts on. If it can make enough storage, it can have enough carbohydrates to store and build with. And then just a reminder about the roots. And so all of these processes, photosynthesis, respiration, transpiration, they have to all happen, and they're all dependent. And if the root systems aren't there, then that kind of messes up that feedback loop. And so I'm just going to stop here for a minute because I just, was looking at all of that stuff, and I've talked quite a bit, and I need to run through this next piece really fast. Any questions?
If you have any questions, just please ask them of Melissa right now. I actually have a question, or actually more of a comment. In my yard, I put mulch around my trees, and I only put it out about 4 or 5 feet, even though these trees are 30 feet high. And I mean, that's okay, but if the roots that are doing all the absorption are out at the drip line or even further, is that mulch really doing a lot of good for those trees?
Well, it's helping. It depends on the depth and the type. But I mean, I could go into a lot of very long conversation with too many facts, but it helps a lot. And there are some absorption roots all the way up to the trunk. And you'll even see them grow on the trunk in the woods, if you see leaves piled up against, you'll see a little bit of root development on a trunk, like absorption roots. But yeah, the primary issue with a lot of lawn is the lawn treatment isn't always, you can do lawn treatment that's compatible with trees, but a lot of fescues are allelopathic, right? They release chemicals that favor themselves, and they are very competitive for nitrogen. And so there are ways to look to research how much you need to put additional. It's not a lot, it's like 4 pounds per 1,000. It's very, very limited nitrogen, but just to give the trees a chance to be competitive with the grass. So the mulch is helping. Recycling carbon is really good. And so if you're ever able to mulch with your own leaves, and maybe you do, that's really good. And that carbon is better than just wood mulch all by itself. The leaf mulch is, I don't really know the science on it, but some of the wood mulches build up manganese in the soil. So, and I don't know exactly what that is, but I do have the reference if anyone wants it.
Great, thank you. Anybody else have any questions for Melissa at this point?
I'll follow on this, Carolyn Haynes. Melissa, thanks. This is really interesting. Question for you about, and this is probably a whole nother topic of green mulch and, using Virginia creeper or Packer aria or something like that as green mulch what's your experience with that? I know several
I'm
people.
in favor. I think it's great, especially if you let leaves accumulate in it, like as the leaves fall. But all of the green mulches, they all release nutrients into the soil if they're adapted to grow in combination with trees. It's wonderful. And then the secondary reason why it's wonderful is if you don't just leave it, like if you can't do that, just you're like to garden, people tend to water a little bit more. They've got something growing under their tree. I mean, digging all the time, especially with soft root, wooded, rooted trees like magnolias and yellowwood's not good. But having that green mulch there, it's really good. I think it's great.
Thanks.
Melissa, could you say something about trees that are really old and in, I think it's called senescence, where
Oh,
they're not growing anymore, but is that true that they're not growing anymore, but they're not dying yet?
yeah, you know, I just had a huge conversation with somebody about this, and I don't think we know a lot about this, right? I like tree science is young, and so there's this expected life expectancy of different trees. But then with champions, right, you get much longer lives. So I think it's a lot resource dependent. Some of it's genetics, right? Different species have different tendencies to decay, like a tulip tree or cherry, more prone to disease. So senescence in people is not the same as in trees. Trees may, you know, like be able to keep going, like a red bud that falls over and sends up another shoot. It's just from the same root system. But some trees can no longer support the wood. And that's why it begins to die back, or it has a pest, or it has a hole in it. So I don't think we understand senescence very well. And some people will say that trees do not senesce. But they do have a life expectancy, and that expectancy is not really completely measurable in the same way that humans don't have a very consistent life expectancy. But trees are totipotent, right? So that they can make new plants out of themselves. So our magnolia, our champion magnolia, it's the umbrella magnolia, an unusual wetland species that's present here, blew over. And I went to measure it to recertify it as a champion. It had blown over. There are 7 new magnolias in that same spot, about 15 feet apart. All of those magnolias are shoots off of the roots of the one that blew down. So they're genetically, I can't verify this, but I can see the roots and I can see that they're shoots. And I think that if I sent them out and asked, I think they would be genetically identical. So that's the kind of process thinking about trees do not senesce. But I can't tell you for sure. Does that answer your question, Nora?
Yes, it does. It does. I'm always, I mean, that's kind of what I expect because you never know with humans whether they're going to make it to 60 or 116, I think the oldest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And some of these guys just have bad luck. And we have a lot of bad luck and we have a lot of people conflict here in Arlington. So I just want to go through this, and I'm going to spend maybe 3 minutes. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. But, you know, we have structural root zones that holds the tree up, and then critical root zones, minimum amount necessary for health. And this is our CRZ detail, and this is publicly available on the website. And so this is how we measure it now. This is just new this in November or December. And before that, we didn't have a structural root zone, and we didn't have these definitions, and we didn't have number 3, which is the multi-stem tree rule. And so this is all new. And it's going to be further modified by a new law in Virginia about mature tree rule in stormwater. And I don't know how that's going to play out, but just to let you know that that's coming. And we do use air excavation for some of our sidewalks and everything. And just kind of explaining, this is really how a root structure might be when there's what we call a site condition problem. And so we have to sometimes, as urban foresters, we can't always use a circle, right? There's a roadway, a house, something, and we know that the roots are not going to be there. And or very unlikely. I can tell you at least 3 places in Arlington where there are roots and roadways and driveways and parking lots, but we can't always use this circle, and so we have to do a projected root zone and kind of go from there. And so we're getting better at kind of looking at how we can move things around in order to avoid that higher and raising up sidewalks and floating sidewalks and doing air excavation for utilities. So these are the things that we're trying to implement at the current time. I'm going to stop there because I talked way too much. And any more questions?
Actually, we could listen to you talk more, so that's not a problem.
I do have a question. Sorry, I can't seem to find my raise hand function here, but it's Carolyn Haynes again. A question for you about, you said that all the other jurisdictions have 1.5 inches and we're doing 1 inch. Can you talk more about that?
It's
Why are we only
complicated.
doing 1?
So I don't really 100% know. And it was 1.5, and there's some research that supported it. And it might change in a modest way back. So
I'm just trying to think how that impacts. I'm thinking like, on tree
Yeah.
preservation, is
Yeah.
it a better, I mean, are we preserving more trees by having a 1 inch as opposed to 1.5, whereas otherwise it'd just
Yeah.
be taken down?
Yeah, and we get pushed a lot to reduce this a lot.
To reduce it below 1 inch.
Yeah, and it's just nothing, there's nothing to support it. But the reason we added the critical root zone in is because when you have a big tree and you have site condition limitations and you can't, we have a lot of people building things without any arboricultural knowledge. And so we have to kind of push it. Tree preservation is very much an art, and not, the science is slowly moving, but it's also new. And so we're trying to, a lot of arborists just don't have the experience with it. And so we're trying to add ways that we can say, well, in this area, there's no excavation whatsoever, and we can't accept it. So.
Great, thank you.
I have a question, Melissa. In areas where, say you have construction, new house construction, and you can't, the contractor does not meet the definition of a critical root zone, and you've got some compaction there. Could you actually go in afterwards and do vertical mulching and maybe save those roots, or do they generally, if that compaction happens, they die, or will other new roots come in and take that if you can vertical mulch or anything?
Yeah, so now we don't vertical mulch quite as much as it does show. Vertical mulching research shows that there's roots that form in that. But now there's this new thing with mixing compost in with an air tool into the top layer. And that helps. Machines do compact down to 24 inches usually, and we're repairing 6 inches, but it helps. You don't, you don't want to do too much and destabilize the tree.
Okay.
There's a lot of support for that research of, and weirdly, just putting down wood chips. I don't know how this works, but the process of, wood chips having mycelium in it and then decaying and the soil biology getting jump started, it not only it decompacts the soil, and the Park Service is doing this in DC, and they're showing a really large improvement in soil compaction just from soil biology, kind of jump starting. And
So that wood chips even more so than like a leaf compost?
yeah,
You're
I
actually
don't
seeing
know why
interesting.
it's wood chips, but
Yeah.
it is. It's wood
Huh.
chips.
Interesting.
And I've stabilized soil. I've halted soil erosion by wood chip application and nothing else, even on slopes. And in Australia, they use it for desalinate, like they have a salt problem with the soil, and some people use wood chips to help with that. So I don't know what the process is. I'm just, and so this is just kind of, I'm sharing information that I've heard, and I've seen it work for erosion control. And there's science behind the decompaction.
Hmm. Okay. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
That's good to know,
Yeah.
actually. Because I would have thought the opposite. I would have thought something that decomposes faster and moves through the soil faster, like leaf litter, would work better. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No idea why it works. And maybe nobody's done that comparative study.
Yeah. Okay.
So Melissa, my question is more about tree stewards doing education to homeowners. We're going to places where the homeowners have invited us to look at their trees and give advice. And from talking with Jim McClone, he says if you could convince them to mulch from property line to property line, that would be best. Which, I jokingly tell people that, and then I say, well, 3 feet would be really good. But he seemed to imply that if you could just get people to mulch as far around their trees as you possibly can, and to water like during droughts, to just make sure that there's enough water to the tree, that would be the best we could do. And I think his
Yeah.
thinking was that with the mulch, if you can even get it to the canopy line, you've kept other things from damaging the tree, like weed whackers or something. I don't know if you have any other just really simple things that, like the green mulch might be one that we could try and work
Yeah.
on. Use Virginia creeper.
I, you know, I have a plant problem, so I've got like 150 different kinds of plants, and we can't go anywhere without getting one. So I don't have any problem expanding a garden bed around a tree and then just having mulch. But the thing is, not everybody's going to be comfortable with that. And so there's different strategies. So with lawn, you can manage a lawn that is managed in such a way that it's tree friendly after the trees get established. You know, some trees deal well with the allelopathy of the fescue, and those would be the plants that naturally come into grasslands like junipers and maples and things. And then older oaks can do it as well. And so you're just, you know, you're managing the nutrient level and you're not trying to get a perfect lawn. So you're always mulching, you're always using mulching mower. So all that nitrogen that you're cutting off goes back in. You're mulching your leaves back in. So you have a higher nutrient environment. So that's not like as good as what Jim suggested, but it's really helpful because not every, you know, if you are too dogmatic, then you just don't have any trees, right? And then the other thing is just to garden with native plants that are naturally compatible, and try to manage your garden. I have a garden at home where we just let things come in, we identify them, and then we only pull out the things that are non-native. So that's how we manage it. And so they're naturally compatible. It's all good.
Thank you. I try not to preach too much, but it's hard.
It is hard. It is hard. And there's the research. So I'm gonna go talk to Jim about this and come back with a better answer.
Well, folks, unless we have any other questions, we're like 10 minutes in. So we're a little bit over. This has been a fascinating talk, Melissa. Thank you so much for taking the time. I see you're still in your office at work, so
Yeah.
sorry for keeping you out of the home late, and apologies to your family, but we really appreciate you doing this.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Okay.
Thank you.